Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Uncork Corner podcast. I'm Nick. I'm here with my co-host Bianca. As you know, we cover the full spread of food and beverage industry topics, and today we are going to be talking kitchen knives. So we brought in some special guests, so we actually have someone that knows what they're talking about today, Evan and Ryan from Strata here in Portland, Maine. So let's start by having each of you give your backgrounds, how you got into the culinary game, and we'll take it from there.
Cool. Well, thanks for having us. Nice to be here. I initially got into the food industry working in like specialty markets with like largely imported or handmade goods. I was working in the Bay Area in San Francisco about 5 years ago, and was working at this pretty well-known market called Buy Right Market, which is a really cool place you guys check out. And kind of kitty corner to the market was a shop much like ours, kind of modeled after, called Bernal Cutlery. And they were kind of one of the pioneers. And by pioneer, I mean about 15 years ago, which isn't too long ago, but in this industry, at least for the West, it's quite new. And I just thought it was super cool. I wasn't, unlike Ryan, who will tell you about himself, I'm not very skilled as a chef. I tend to nerd out on the sharpening and history and whatnot. So I thought it was just really cool. I've never seen a shop like it before, and I just spent a good amount of my break time running down the street and asking them a bunch of questions and just drooling over their selection. And really, from there on, I've been self-taught. It's not really any consolidated sources of information, at least as a whole. So it's really, you got to go out there and find this information. So I've spent, 10 to 20 to, maybe 30,000 hours studying and practicing and learning what we can. And now we're here. Which is pretty crazy. So it's been a wild ride, and there's always, really, truly, it's one of those fields where there's more to learn. It's such a worldwide based application, cooking, and tools such as knives, so old. So it's always something to learn, and always, since there's a skill-based component to it, always a way to improve your skills. So it's just been kind of geeking out since then, honestly. It's not much more than that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm Ryan. I'm sort of Evan's apprentice. I sort of have a little bit more of a culinary background. I grew up with my grandfather owning a pizza restaurant, so I was always there doing that stuff. And then when the hammer really started to come down, and I had to decide when I was 18 what I wanted to do, my final decision was, what makes me happy. So I went and actually started working at Hugo's under Rob Evans, who's, somewhat popular in Portland, Maine. He's a pretty, really big influence on me and taught me sort of everything I knew. So I was working at Hugo's to start, went over to Duck Fat, was sort of running Duck Fat for a little while, went out to Pai Men, learned some Asian cuisine, went down to the Royal River Grill House. The entire time I just really enjoyed, knife skills, working with knives, and just, it's a way to sort of, separate yourself. It's just by having those super clean cuts, and just, you can show your attention and your care for what you're doing based on, how well you do your knife skills and whatnot. And then as soon as Evan opened up, I pretty much showed up one of the first days there, sort of fell in love, and was kind of like, all right, I'm going to do whatever I can to get myself a job here. And, within 2 months, I was, putting in my effort and started working there. So it's been a little over a year that I've been full time. So, it's, as Evan said, there's just an endless amount to learn, and having Evan to look up to and be able to talk to about, it's one of those things where I get so into a hobby, and, sometimes you get so far into a hobby, you lose people to talk to about it. They're like, and Evan's just someone that I can always have that deep conversation with about the culinary industry and about knives, because it's just endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, I think we both have some obsessive personalities that allow us, endless entertainment and strive for perfection, although it's never attainable. So we work pretty well together. So it's been pretty fun.
Yeah,
That's
it's
awesome.
definitely seems like a very meticulous skill and job to do. So I imagine you would have to have that type of personality to really enjoy it and get a lot out of it.
Yeah, definitely. Yep.
Yeah,
That's why Nick and I are
100%.
here. All we talk about is food and booze all the time and everything related. So
Yeah.
do what you
Yeah.
love. That's what they say.
Exactly. And food is such
Honestly.
an easy way to connect with people.
That's the truth.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's talk a little bit about the store itself. So I know you guys really specialize in it was Japanese whetstone sharpening techniques. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah,
And
it's one
we use,
aspect of it.
yeah, we use a multitude of tools, but largely, you get a lot of precision with your hands, and you can really get down to the nitty gritty. And there's hundreds, there's thousands of natural stones from around the world. Japan has a very unique tectonic history that yields some very special stones, but there are also stones dotted everywhere. So we use kind of whatever we need to do to get the job done. We have a specialized belt grinder. We have a buffer. And then we work our fingers to the bone on whetstone.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And with the introduction of ceramic stones, which are geared specifically towards knife sharpening, it seems like it's just going to be an always growing and changing world where there's never going to be that golden standard of the way to get it done. And that's fun in itself.
So if you had to sum it up in kind of like a paragraph or two, what would you say? Kind of give me the whole bio of Strata, the store, sort of how, I guess, you already told me a bit about your personal background, but what was the vision behind starting this store? What is your main thing? I know you guys have a nice little shop with many knives all over of all different styles, and it was really cool getting I met Ryan yesterday when I was in there, and I got to check some stuff out. It's really cool. So tell me exactly overall how you would sum up what you do.
Well, we import and service the best, generally, kitchen cutlery from around the world, primarily Japan and Europe, who those two, Europe is broad, but, those two centers probably have the most cataloged history and vibrant, still ongoing history. So a lot of our inventory comes from those two areas. There's even within a single country, say France, there's lots of subregions, and those each have their own, sub styles. And then you get in Japan, and it's crazy. It's can be very overwhelming for a lot of people, but it's endlessly fascinating, and it also means that there's probably something exactly for you. But we spent a lot of time. Years really building connections. This is since these are all handmade, you can basically think of it as functional art. So you can't just go online and talk to nobody and you flip through a catalog and order X number of these and Y number of those. This very much a trust-based, face-to-face business. It's very old. So it is exciting to meet people all around the world, but we spend a lot of time finding the best things we can, bringing them in, and then we also service stuff as well. So we kind of have two aspects of the business currently. Hopefully we'll be expanding to some classes and educational components as well. But we service the stuff we sell, but we also service things that people bring in as well.
You have a huge wide variety of different things for really everybody who needs a blade of some sort. So for anyone who is unfamiliar with knives in general, I think a lot of people aren't familiar with any sort of like cutlery. They just say, oh, they are, it is what it is. It's just an easy thing for me to be home and just, cut my stuff with. What is the difference? Like, what is it that makes a good knife a good knife? What is it that makes that blade, the quality that it is?
That's a good question.
After you,
Yeah,
you got it.
All right, sure. Well, we really do say, and we really do mean that a good knife is one that you like to use and that gets the job done safely. That could be something you got at the dollar store. It could be something you found in your grandparents' basement, or it could be, you know, one of the more exotic things that we have here. But really, it's the inside that counts, for lack of a better term. What makes a good knife, at least objectively, is its metallurgical structure. And that's something that you can't see. It's only something that you can experience in use with food and product and in servicing, be it sharpening or repair or polishing, what have you. So, you know, we give the example, if you ever see a knife that's $1,000 next to a knife that's $100, and they look almost exactly the same, and you're like, what the heck is going on? This is silly. Hopefully there's better materials in the more expensive one to begin with, but you're really paying for what's under the hood, the metallurgical structure. And the blade is made out of metal, so the metallurgical structure is what determines everything. Of course, I mean, there are other things as well as you know, how well done the grind is, and that's what the blade looks like throughout its length, which will have some impacts on edge retention, structural integrity, food release, etc. But ultimately, it comes down to what it's made out of, and who basically cooks the steel, so to speak. You know, a good smith that's worth his weight in gold is, you know, you can almost think of them as a 3-star Michelin chef. You know, they can take just about any ingredient and turn it into something special. But you know, nobody knows anything about knives. We didn't at one point either, right? So it throws off a lot of people when they see some of the price points, you know, especially some of the Japanese stuff can have. But really, you're paying for metallurgical perfection. So if you took a knife that's, you know, one of our more expensive models, and you broke it in half, please don't do that. And then looked under that fractured piece with a microscope, you'd see all of these super tiny dots, which we call grains. So grain, you know, steel is just made out of kind of globule pieces of iron and carbon, whatever alloys you have in there that make up that steel, squished together. And they orient themselves in certain ways, depending on the steel and the hardness, etc. But you tend to want a finer grain. You can get more out of a finer grain. You know, we're boiling down a lot of complicated things here, but so really, you're looking for a fine grain steel that's ground well with good materials, ideally, and that ultimately just fits your hand well, and that you like. You know, you could like something that's less expensive than something that's more expensive and objectively better, but you know, at the end of the day, like we said, a good knife is one that you like. So it really comes down to what feels best for you.
Yeah, I would say two of the biggest questions to ask yourself when coming into our shop. First off, is, you know, something of preference. What type of handle would you like? We carry things that are both wa style handled, which are your traditional sort of Japanese ones. They typically have the magnolia handle with the black horn ferrule, or you have your, you know, Western style handle, typically, which is something that like a Wusthof or a Hinkle is going to have, you know, the thing with the 3 rivets in it and your heavier bolster. Practical difference between the two of them is that, you know, the Western handle is going to be a little bit heavier, so it's going to sort of put the weight back in your hand a little bit more and give you a little bit more ease of using the heel of your knife. And the Japanese knives, their handles are typically lighter, so it'll make it a little more blade heavy and tilt it a little more. So outside of the idea of just, you know, how comfortable the knife is in your hand, you know, asking yourself what side of the knife you like to use. Are you someone who uses the tip of your knife often or the heel of your knife? And that'll sort of help direct which direction and handle you want. And then the other major question is stainless steel and carbon steel. Carbon steel is the kind that has the potential to rust if you like leave it wet. It also forms a patina, which is the acidic reaction. So when you're cutting lemons, tomatoes, onions, it's going to stain the blade. So the patina actually is an extremely surface level reaction. The deeper set your patina gets, the less likely it is for rust to form. So it's one of those things where, you know, you need to be a little more mindful of a carbon steel knife. But the reason that people deal with that rust management is how much easier it typically is to sharpen on the other end. Carbon steel knives are vastly easier. It's just sort of like as a mental image, I like to say that carbon steel is like sanding a nice hardwood, and stainless steel is like sanding leather. It can sort of gum up. It's a little bit. So if sharpening is something that you really want to focus on, recommended towards thinking about a carbon steel knife. But as far as the major questions to ask yourself, I think that those are the two that really help, pinpoint what type and style of knife you're going to get.
And as Ryan was touching on, the reason that carbon steel or stainless steel is such a big question, besides the staining component, is that the easiness of servicing comes into play, and that's really why people continue to produce carbon steel and b continue to use them. Is going back to that metallurgical structure. Carbon steel is a lot easier to service because it generally, there's a lot of generalizations in this. There's never really straightforward answers. But generally has a much finer metallurgical structure, which allows it to be serviced a lot better. Whenever you add chromium, the alloy typically used to make something stainless, it kind of gunks up this fine metallurgical structure that carbon steel tends to have going for it, and becomes to a certain degree on the steel and method of production, et cetera, a little bit more difficult to service. So that is definitely a big one for sure.
So the next thing that I wanted to get into is kind of this kitchen knife 101 sort of talk when it comes to actually using the knives. So there's obviously a huge variety of different knife styles, and I'm sure there's some that are very fine and are meant to be used for one specific purpose. But if you had to pick, let's say 5 or 6, I'm not going to put a specific number on it, but what are your number one or your top styles to have in the kitchen?
That's a good question. I'm going to let, I can certainly answer this question, but I'm going to let the chef here, Ryan, answer that for you guys.
Yeah, so I think that it's a very good question, what knives to have in your arsenal. And I think that, starting out, people who jump in and get that 6 to 8 knife set, I think that you should restrain yourself. I think you start off and get, 1 to 2 knives. I'll discuss, the 5 major ones I'm thinking about. But, when I was a chef, I noticed that the people who had the most knives in their roll had the most cuts on their hands because they're not getting used to that knife, A well-trained chef with a traditional chef knife should be able to handle 95% of the tasks. So, having a large selection of knives isn't something that you're not going to typically be rotating through them in one session. It may be nice to have them around just because you like to, disperse the wear on the knife, keeps them sharper if you're using them less, each of them. But for the most part, majoritively, you're not going to be switching knives a lot of times through during, an average time cooking. The 5 major types that I think that, are ones to really consider potentially getting are the Giotto or chef knife, which is your very traditional, your chef knife looking. Wusthof makes them, it's your very classic looking chef knife. That's used once again for 95% of things. When I'm discussing uses, culinary knives are not butchery knives. You shouldn't use a culinary knife in a butchery situation. Their metallurgical structure isn't really geared for that. They're typically a little more brittle, so you want to stay away from butchery stuff with culinary knives.
Before we move on, can you just elaborate on what some of those, like the difference between a culinary versus a butchery? Are you talking, let's say, chopping through bone or something like that? Is that what you're referring to?
I'll let the butcher, Evan, handle this one.
Oh yeah, I forgot I did some butchery. Well, to just critique what you just said, you don't cut through bone. You saw through bone. Meat cleavers are not meant to go cleaving through bone. It's kind of a misconception. You use a cleaver to finish the cut that the saw did, for the most part, of course. But meat butchery, they tend to be made of to a softer level of hardness, and that's actually something that we might talk about, is the differences in hardness of steels. Japanese knives largely are defined as being quite hard, while Western knives, your German, French, American knives, tend to be made to softer levels of hardness, and that does have real world applications. And sorry to go on this tangent, but it's important. With a hard steel like a Japanese knife, that blade can tolerate keener edges. So keenness, sharpness is just a point, the very edge, with less material behind it. So if that material behind your edge is hard, you need less of it to support your edge. So you can make your knives thinner and thus lighter. And since the material is hard, it is more wear resistant in use. So longer lived edges. So Japanese culinary knives tend to be thinner, lighter, sharper, and longer lasting. However, the thinner and harder you make edges to get these performance benefits that largely define Japanese culinary knives, the more brittle it becomes. So like Ryan was saying, you don't want to take, especially Japanese culinary knives, to a butchery application, because in butchery applications, you're seeing a lot of use and abuse. And for that, you want a softer steel, which is what largely defines Western knives. So while Western knives tend to be thicker, heavier, and can't get as sharp nor last as long, the main pro for the average user is that unlike those thin, hard, brittle edges that will chip upon abuse, these soft edges will deform to a side. And that's often why they are paired with honing rods, those little cylindrical metal things that you go back and forth on the blade. Those are not sharpeners. Don't use those to sharpen your edge. Use them as sparingly as possible as well, because like a paper clip, the more you use those rods, the more you're flipping that edge back and forth, and the more you weaken it and actually shorten your edge life. So, a lot of people think that those are sharpeners, and the first thing they do is they get in the kitchen and they pick it up and they go as fast as they can, thinking that they're better than they are. We've all done it. Don't do that. But with butchery knives, they tend to be thicker and softer, so that they can go up against hard things like bone. So that's when your meat cleaver is super thick, because it literally has it needs more mass to support that edge if it's soft, but you need the mass to go through hard things to help literally absorb force. So they tend to be made metallurgically quite soft. That's good if that answers the question. So I go on all these tangents and I just can't lose myself. So.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah, did I answer the question?
I think that answers the question.
Great.
Yeah.
Learn something new.
Yeah, I mean, if we wanted to get back to the five,
Yep,
then
definitely.
Awesome. So yeah, so there's the Gyuto, which is your typical chef knife. Like I said, use that 95% of what you do. If there was one knife to really spend your money on and make sure that you have its quality knife, I would say it'd be your chef knife. The next knife I'm going to talk about is called a Santoku, and this right here is basically it can be your chef knife. It's the Japanese sort of home cook's knife. It's typically a little bit stouter of a knife, little shorter and then taller, which is sort of not the thickness dimension, but the height of the knife when it's not the length, sort of like how much knuckle clearance you have. Typically, Santokus have a little bit higher knuckle clearance and a little bit shorter length. That sort of lends them a little bit better towards a somewhat veggie diet. The nice thing about the Santokus is that they're great for a lot of chopping, the push and pull style chopping. I guess before I go forward, it's the two styles of choppings you're going to mostly see are your sort of rolling chop, which is where you have the knife constantly on the cutting board. You're just sort of rolling back and forth, and then that's how you're getting the food under the knife, is through the rock. Or you're doing the push and pull style, which is where you're taking the knife completely off the board, lifting it up, and then chopping down. The rolling chop is typically what's used for the Gyuto because it has that nice belly to it. And then the Santoku is where you start to see a little bit more flattening of the edge, where typically the first third to half of the Santoku is going to be almost dead flat, besides just a little blip at the heel, which allows you to do that, sort of push and pull style chopping, and then you have that whole section of the knife come in contact with the board at the same time. You don't need any rocking motion or anything to sort of guarantee you've cut all the way through, unlike a fully curved knife where only that one point of the ball is sort of touching the board. So the Santoku is sort of, if you like the push and pull style chopping, that might be the way for you to go for your chef knife. The third one is the Japanese vegetable knife, or the Nikiri, which looks a lot like a cleaver, but it's a lot thinner knife, typically as thin as your Santoku or Gyuto is going to be. and it sort of doesn't have a point to the knife. It sort of is rounded a little bit. So a lot of Nikiris do have a tiny bit of a round to the end, so you can manage a little bit of a rolling chop if you need, but definitely not what they're made for. They're pretty much strictly for that push and pull style chop. Great for going through larger vegetables. Think of yourself cutting a head of cabbage and sort of how you're just going to attack it from the top and go right through. And having that nice flat edge on the bottom means you don't need to, you can just, sort of go like Morimoto and just bam, 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 bam. You can make eye contact with people as you're doing stuff, because typically in that style of chop, your hand is in contact with the blade at the entire time. So you're sort of allowed to, take your eyes off for a second and look impressive. So I think that, the Nikiri typically is a knife that you could do 95% of your tasks with. It just doesn't have the versatility of that point. So that's typically what restricts it from people using it as their main knife. Speaking of like a little tip, the petty knife or utility knife is sort of the next knife. It can be anywhere from a paring knife, which is, your little 2-inch knife, which is typically used for peeling in your hand, or your petty knife, which is up to, sometimes 5 inches, which is typically a shorter knife, more of a little like needle nimble knife. You use that to take the cores out of your tomatoes, other things like that. I like to call them sandwich knives or bar knives. If you just need to cut a lemon in half, or maybe just a tomato and an onion for a sandwich and you don't need your full chef knife, you can just use that. So that's definitely a great little addition to have in your mix. And that's typically one that you'll see stay sharp the longest, because it's typically a lower impact knife. You're not going through your denser vegetables with that, and you're not really hitting your cutting board very hard with your thin little knife. So it's going to stay sharp for a while. And then the last one, which I think is the most dependent on your diet, would be something like a slicer. That can be a single bevel slicer, which double bevel, single bevel thing we'll get into in a little bit. That's a whole can of worms. But the slicer is good for, slicing typically proteins and things like that. So, if you find yourself slicing a lot, a slicer is great, but a nice long chef knife or gyuto could sort of do that same purpose as well. So that one's, I would say the most on the fringe of necessity when it comes to your knife sort of selection. But yeah, that's sort of my opinion on 5 that are, pretty good things to think about if you want to add to your collection, and that wouldn't necessarily step on each other's toes. And then of course a butchery knife in there if you eat a lot of meat.
You guys have mentioned a few times keeping knives or knives going dull, I should say, or maybe they're getting just like all that wear and tear. It gets on them at some point. For someone who sharpens their knife the right way, how long does that on average, does it stay to a point where you won't need to sharpen it again?
So we have no idea.
Yeah, it's one of those like, how often should you get new shoes? I don't know how you wear them. I don't know how aggressively, it truly is a thing where it
don't go by time.
Yeah, it's don't go by time. There's not a certain amount of strokes or anything. It truly is when you're not happy with how it's performing anymore. Which is, I know it's just sort of vague thing to say to somebody, but truly, we've seen people who bring in knives that we would, you can see they're as thick as the spine and it's dead, but they're like, no, I've been using it up till recently, and it's, so the levels people are willing to accept is what's considered sharp, varies so much as well. So it's just when you're like, nah, it's not sharp anymore.
If the knife is crushing things instead of slicing or chopping, it's probably a good indicator.
I mean, if that's the method of cooking you like, just crushing stuff, keep going with it. Yeah, I mean, we get that question every day, and it really is impossible to answer. There's too many variables, and it's not like these knives come in rated at 6 months of retention or 8 months of retention or anything like that. It's really dependent on use and what is acceptably sharp for you, and that's probably what I find acceptably sharp is different. So it really, a lot of people get hung up in time and number of knives and all this stuff. Really, the answer is it depends on you. There is no correct duration. There is no correct number of knives. It really is just what works, what you think you need, and what works best for you.
And so another thing that I wanted to get into when kind of talking about this initial, the styles and things like that, is where to go and what to look for when purchasing them. Because a lot of people, if they walked into, a general kitchen store, and I know I worked at Lowe's before, that I probably didn't know a lot of things about a lot of the stuff that they had there, but people expect everyone to be an expert. So if there's someone working that store that, isn't really well versed in the knives or anything, what can someone do to really make sure that they're not wasting their money and getting something that isn't right for them?
That's a very good question. And the difficulty is that this happens with any consumer product, but marketing has destroyed 99% of what is true. And there really only are a handful of other shops, if we could be so modest to say, on our level in North America. Knives have become so over marketed and so full of BS and so confusing that what people do is they go online and they search what is the best knife or what have you. And they're going to read the same article that somebody else read, and it's going to be, one of the big 5 brands or some shit. Something like that. For example, again, no one knows anything about knives. So let's say you work for the New York Times and you get assigned a knife article, and you're like, why am I being assigned this? I know nothing. So I'm going to go online and I'm going to search stuff, and I'm just going to read what everybody else has read, and a lot of that is written by the marketing departments of these big brands. Yeah, it's crazy. So it is hard to, honestly, it is hard for a beginner to get into it because it is so confusing. We like to say that the best knives are the ones that you've never heard of, because the people making those knives are too busy making good knives because everybody wants their knives, and they don't need to market their knives. Everybody in the know knows where to go, but how do you get into the know? Yeah, that's difficult. And honestly, we don't really have a good answer for you. That's, I think, where down the road, we'll be adding a lot of educational information to our website. So it's not just a web store, it's a place to get actual information. But, how do you find us? We don't do any marketing. So it is tough, definitely. And there's not really an easy answer. I would, if I was a layperson, I would maybe ask my chef friend, but then you have it all over again. You get into restaurants one of 2 ways. You either go to culinary school, where they have some deal with Henkel's or Wusthof or whatever, and those are the knives that they swear by. So those are the knives that you use, and then that you swear by to everybody else, right? Or you go straight to the restaurant and you learn about knives from the guy who went to culinary school, right? And so it's just a crazy, vicious feedback cycle. And that's why 99% of the knives that people drop off here are the same stuff, because that's people buy what they see. And also finding out about this stuff is difficult and confusing. So it's not really, it's tough, and hopefully, over time we can make a mark and educate people, but it's very clouded, on purpose, unfortunately, so that these bottom line brands can get your business.
And knives, of course, are such a broad spectrum of pricing. I think there are knives that are probably great to have that are in the low hundreds, and there are knives that go all the way up to in the thousands. So for somebody, just your everyday person, they're at home, they're just cooking in the kitchen, they're doing their own thing, they're not necessarily a chef. How do you recommend that person go about selecting a knife? Do they need to spend, $500+ for something, or do you also have really good quality knives that are in that lower price point, so they're more reasonable for the everyday home chef?
Yeah, I think Ryan might have a little bit better input on that, but just, you don't need to drop a lot of money. It's one of the first things that we say when people walk in here, because they're bewildered by some of the prices. We try our best, we focus on largely handmade stuff. So, getting low price points is just inherently difficult. But you really don't need to spend a lot of money to get a good one. In fact, we highly suggest that you buy them one at a time, and you buy what you can afford, and go from there, because you don't want to have bad knife skills and not know what you're getting yourself into. Like buying a sports car and then you take it off-roading, and then you broke your car and you're like, oh my God, I just lost $30,000. And then you try to bring it back to us and you're like, I tried to carve a turkey with this vegetable knife. And then we're like, what do you know? But Ryan can probably talk a little bit more about what you need to get started as like the home chef, or maybe if you're even starting your first job in a restaurant.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to being a home cook, I find that, you know, most people get their knives when they go off to college, or they go, you know, or they get married, or, you know, the two big ones I find. You're typically not buying your own knives. It's a lot of times, which is a pretty curious thing as well, because, you know, if people are, you know, they didn't buy their knives, so they're not putting in that thought and effort into you know, what they're purchasing, or what they have. I think that, you know, the best way to do it is just sort of, depending on whether if you have knives now that you're just looking to replace, or you're just looking to get your first knife. I think that either way, the right way to go is that sort of chef knife or santoku, that universal knife that you could do anything with. I think that, you know, focusing on getting one knife and then potentially adding a second if you find out through using the first one that it isn't really performing the task that you're looking for, that might be the time to get the second one. But instead of spending, you know, $300 to sometimes up to $1,000 for these big sets of 8 to 12 knives with the steak knives and the honing rod and the block and all that, just, you know, reel it back and sort of, you know, ask yourself those questions that were sort of outlined in the beginning about, you know, do you want stainless steel or carbon steel? Hopefully you can find yourself a location where you can get a couple knives into your hands. I think that that's really important because, you know, the weights of knives vary drastically. And even when people hold, you know, Western knives with that heavier Western style handle, but it's from Japan, you know, half the time they're like, wow, this is really light, you know, compared to a German knife. So I think that, you know, potentially asking your friends if anybody has a, you know, a higher quality knife that they like, and, you know, really seeing if you can just potentially get your hands on one or talk to the person and see what they like about it. Maybe you can find a more niche knife store like us that, you know, is going to be able to fill you in on the information you're looking for. You know, like Evan said, hopefully we're going to have a lot more information on our website to really, you know, be a more fulfilling experience while you're there. I know that we're always trying to have, you know, an experience with us be a learning experience as well as a purchasing experience. We're very big on the idea of, you know, just coming in and learning what we have, learning about knives first, and not necessarily purchasing right out of the gate. You know, I mean, if you need a knife, you need a knife. If it's your first one, but if you're more or less going to be looking to replace a knife out of your set, you know, take a good month and spend a couple nights working with each of those knives and see what aspects you like about them and what you don't. And then, you know, try to find, you know, a somewhat, not reputable, most places are reputable, but a more knowledgeable knife store, and see, you know, because a lot of times, you know, places like us are going to be able to sort of zero in on a knife or two that will typically work for a person based off, you know, their needs and whatnot. So you'd be surprised, you know, how good of an idea it is to, you know, email, you know, one of us or your local knife store or something, and, you know, just ask us, because we love talking about knives and we'll tell you about it, and hopefully you'll get as excited about knives as we are. And, you know,
yeah, to try and nail down a little bit of a price point thing, I'd say that you're going to get as a first, or like if you're getting your first legit knife, you know, most people are spending about $150 to $250. You know, the majority of our business is knives below $250. We sell a ton of them. They're really good. Some of our favorite knives are $75. You know, really, you know, when you're getting up into the hundreds and hundreds to thousands, it really is functional art, and you probably hopefully know what you're getting yourself into, and it's beyond the tool at that point. You know, for a lot of people, this is also a collectible industry as well, because, you know, especially for the Japanese stuff, it's truly generational, you know, teachings. And once a smith or a sharpener retires, their stuff is gone forever, and prices can skyrocket. But as an average user, you're going to get a lot out of $150, which might sound like a lot for some people, but if you're coming to a place like us, that you're getting way more out of those $150 than you are going to the mall, or I don't know where people get knives elsewhere. Yeah, I mean, you try to find people like us, and we try to give you honest. We're salespeople second, honestly. We want you to have a good experience, so you come back.
And that's, I think, a good takeaway too, is $100-something for a really high quality knife that was selected by you guys that deal with it every day is going to be probably a better overall knife than the $150 mass produced one that's really, you're paying a lot for the name, right?
Yeah. I mean, quality is one thing, right? But it's also important to remember that the knives that we carry, at least, are coming from people, not robots. All right. So a lot of this money is going to them, and it's supporting their families. The price tag that you pay for largely on these mass-produced brands is, again, their marketing budget, a massive marketing budget. And that's where a lot of that money is going to, and they're bottom dollar companies, right? So they're sourcing these materials from the cheapest places they can get. That's right on the border of dropping off the quality to what they say they can do.
Yeah, not to like throw anything under the bus, but as far as some somewhat excessive advertising, I think that Dalstrong is a somewhat hilarious example. You can go on Amazon and see that they have, I mean, they must be doing a great job for graphic designers and keeping them hired. But it's a pretty funny thing when you because you can notice what they're focusing on, and
some people might like Dalstrong, and that's great.
Yeah, no, there's something great. No, there's nothing wrong about that. I mean, they're definitely, they have their place. But I think that if you find yourself getting sort of a mass brand knife and you've sort of breached that $250 range, maybe looking for something mass produced, because one thing that these large companies do have is a lifelong warranty. You can snap that thing in half, send both pieces back, and they'll send you a new one. And that's something that you're getting. With a handmade piece of functional art, you're not necessarily awarded that same luxury. But I think that as soon as you start hitting that $250 mark, you can somewhat easily, if you know the right channels, find yourself a completely handmade knife and know the person who made it, who's a pretty amazing, who's a recognized high quality blacksmith. And yeah, I think that, for a surprisingly low amount, you can get yourself a knife made by truly one of the top 10 smiths on the planet. And I think that there's a lot of fun in that.
So the next thing that I really wanted to get into too before we get out of here is maintenance and storage. So obviously, like you talked about earlier, honing and sharpening, two different things. What are, first of all, what methods of sharpening? Obviously, not everyone's going to have you guys down the street that they can take their stuff to. So if you're someone that lives somewhere without that access, what's the best way to keep your knives sharp at home? And then I would say, what is the best times when do you need to sharpen and when do you need to hone, if that's something you're going to do?
Question. Well, a few places like us do typically accept mail-ins, so that is an option. But for exclusively being at home, don't get those jigs. There's so many jigs I can't even describe them, because what happens with those, pull through, or I don't know, they got other things nowadays. People every day come into us and then they ask us about their jig that came with their block, and then ask us if it works. And we're like, why are you asking us? Like, if it works, you wouldn't even be here, So those are really just money makers for a lot of these companies, and they have a one size fits all type of sharpening process that can really, if you have a legitimate knife, can damage them. But generally, unfortunately, we'd say the best method is whetstone. But also those have the highest learning curve, so that's tough. But really, you want something wide. For example, the inverse being the honing rod, right? So that's a small 1/2 inch diameter, right? And it's really hard. It's hardened on purpose. But whenever you put a cylindrical object onto a flat object, like an edge that's also thin and hard, very little surface area contact actually occurs. So any amount of force that you put in there is amplified onto that tiny bit of edge that you're on. And again, a lot of people like to go as fast as they can, and they're just torquing that thing back and forth. With like a leather strap, for example, it's 1 to 2, 2.5 inches wide. That leather is soft, so leather's a good one, but you're dispersing force across a wider area, and it's a lot safer. So generally, if you could find leather, you can really strap on just about anything, including newspaper is a good one. Newspaper generally has a little bit of silica in it, which is generally the main abrasive in Japanese natural stones, for example. But you can strap on your jeans or textured canvas or anything like that, generally in what's called an edge trailing stroke direction. So the edge trails the spine in direction of movement. So you're not going edge first into whatever you're working. So if you're doing that on leather, for example, you'll just cut your leather up. But if you are dragging the edge backwards, it's a lot more passive of a force, and it's a lot more gentle and harder to screw up your edge. So we would suggest you get leather straps. You can also load them up with what are called micro abrasives, like chromium oxide or aluminum oxide or diamond spray. Those are probably the safest bets. You really don't even really need to know how to do it super well, because it's just a lot more passive on your edge than something like a hardened small cylindrical honing rod. So that would be our best suggestion. Other than that, maybe getting a really high grit whetstone where you're not removing a lot of metal, so that's also safe as well. But it's tough. I mean, that's how a lot of these other brands get you, right? They know that people don't know what they're doing, and they damage their knives, and so they gotta get new knives. It's tough, right? And generally the things with the best results have the highest learning curve, as much with life. But that's what, we answer emails all day about this stuff. So, contacting us or, another reputable retailer, we can walk you through it, and, hopefully we'll have some videos and stuff like that. But maybe Ryan has a hack or two that.
Yeah. Kind of on like sort of when do you need sharpening and when do you need honing? Honing is typically really only used on like a softer German knife, or not necessarily German knife, but just a softer steeled knife. Honing is the act of realigning your bent edge. So using a steel honing rod, you're basically just, dragging the edge across it and sort of straightening out any, bends that you might have along your edge, giving you access to that tip again. So a lot of times you're not going to want to do that really with any sort of harder Japanese steeled knife. Once you sort of hit a certain hardness, your steel isn't really going to bend anymore. It's going to chip instead. It's going to be, so using a metal honing rod on like a nice hard Japanese knife is actually going to do damage to it. So I would say that unless your knife came with a honing rod or like came with a block, like I would steer away from using a honing rod. And unless it is a nice soft, or unless you notice that there's that sort of bent edge to it. But a honing rod, it can be very dangerous around the wrong knife.
That's how we make all our money, is we charge repair costs on overuse of honing rods because people think that they're sharpeners.
Yeah,
so that's why we're so big about not using them. It's because no one knows how to use them, right? And
exactly.
Fine, but like,
and getting something like the sharpening rods. So we have sharpening rods, which are basically those honing rods, but they're made out of ceramic, the same thing that the synthetic sharpening stones are made out of. So getting something like that and learning how to properly use it with edge trailing strokes will that is something that you could use on any knife, On your nicer carbon steel knives, you can use nice high grit ones. But I would recommend using something more like a ceramic rod, which actually does the act of sharpening, which in turn will also help with those sort of bent edges. You could use it as a honing rod.
But to answer your question about when to hone versus when to sharpen, honing or stropping or whatever you want to call it is a band-aid. So you start using that when the knife stops performing the way you want it to, and then you get it properly sharpened, which is a much more step-by-step controlled process when the band-aid no longer stops the bleeding, to speak grotesquely. If that makes any sense. Eventually, you will need a proper reset of the edge, not just putting more and more band-aids.
Do you see any place in the home or for someone that, maybe doesn't have the time or want to put in the effort to really learning how to perfect using a whetstone and using some sort of maybe more of a belt sharpener? Now, with a high-end kitchen knife, obviously that's going to do more damage than good. Probably something that's really high-end, like what you guys deal with. But obviously they'd have their applications more of a, general tool knife that you don't mind scratching up or doing something like that too, like pocket knife even. What do you guys see, I guess, the place for those?
I actually would say that's probably worse, because with a belt grinder or whatever machine you want to talk about, those are moving at speed, right? So the margin for error is actually smaller. When you're doing this by hand, you can only do X strokes per minute, but in a grinder or what have you, you're doing hundreds of strokes per second. So it's actually possibly more damaging if you don't know what you're doing. So the interesting thing is less efficiency or slower speed actually means more precision, because you have the time to readjust and try a different angle out or what have you. Rather, if you're not paying attention for a quarter second, you could have just ruined your knife on a grinder. So, like we do have a grinder that has some special properties to it, but that's learning a whole new method of sharpening, and actually not something we try to teach until you have a firm understanding of using whetstone. So, but I mean, it's faster, obviously, but and best in some applications, especially if you have big, thick knives, you need to honk off a bunch of metal, but it can actually be more difficult to learn and also even more dangerous for your person.
And you guys, of course, work with a lot of different things. So one question I have before we wrap up, what are your favorite knives to actually work with? Are any of them, is there one that stands out to you that is the most interesting, or in terms of just working with it and kind of, creating?
Yeah, 100%. I was lucky enough to go to have this sort of amazing period where I was half at Strata the knife store and half out at the Tuscan table. So I was able to use all these amazing knives I was sort of getting. I've used, the crazy $2,000 knives. I've used, the $1.50 knives, and everything in between. And hands down, my favorite knife to use is called the Hitohira Tanaka. Tanaka is the blacksmith. Kyuzo is the sharpener. It's a blue one steel, 240 millimeter Migaki Gyoto with a Taihei rosewood handle. And it is it's the perfect knife, down to edge retention and how easy it sharpens, grind, everything about it is my dream knife. And if I only had one knife ever in my life, it would be that one.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing with some of the knives we have is they've got such long names, but but they're all descriptive, which is pretty cool. So if you know how to read the language, you really can talk nitty gritty. Like I said earlier in this session, I'm less skilled than Ryan is. So I actually really like Nikiri, those vegetable chopping knives, because of how easy they are to use. They're one of our, behind the two main multi-purpose knives, is Hantoku and Gyoto / chef knife. Surprisingly for me, when I first started, I didn't foresee the Nikiri becoming so popular, but it's so popular because it's so easy to use. It's just really ultimately a chopping knife, although you can do more with it the more skills you have. But because I stumble over my own fingers, I like the Nikiri. It's that rectangular shaped one, and it looks cool, so it's a conversation starter too.
I love that. And it's really helpful to learn all this. I think everyone's going to take a lot away from it. Before we wrap, where can everybody find you online and on social media so they can either visit you themselves or shop? I know you guys have a shop online feature, I believe. So if they can do that as well.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we're located at 93 Washington Ave in Portland, Maine. We have a web store, www.strataportland.com. And then we've got our Instagram feed at Strata Portland for now. Yeah. But you can always email us as well at info@strataportland.com. We're always happy to answer questions and help you guide you down this endless rabbit hole.
Awesome. Well, we thank you guys so much for coming on and talking to us tonight. We sure learned a lot, and you guys are probably going to be seeing a lot more of me in the store.
Great.
Thank you, man. Thank you.
Yeah, we can just talk knives. Yeah, it'd be great. All right. Nice meeting everybody.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Cheers.
Well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Be sure to follow us on social at Uncorked Corner and on the blog at uncorkedcorner.com for a taste of more food and beverage content.
And if you enjoyed the show, don't forget to leave a comment, subscribe, rate, and review on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Thanks for listening.